It's Mandy back with another video. Today I want to talk about incidental learning versus the rules. And this is another time that little separation that I do with autism spectrum disorders and non-spectrum spectrumers come in handy. So what is incidental learning? Incidental learning is when we watch a child developing as an infant and a baby, how they look around and pick up cues from their environment to change and alter, modify their behavioral responses. Kids who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders typically aren't able to pick up on those cues, adjust and modify their behavior as well. Again, there's a spectrum here. We all make a big spectrum of where we fall in this skill development. But if you think about how early that skill starts of using incidental learning, it starts when we're so young. Every day we're constantly building on that strategy. If we're not using and incorporating that type of strategy, like again, a lot of people diagnosed with spectrum disorders are not able to, we are losing many signals and cues from the environment to tell us how to behave, and then pairing the emotional response and feeling with those outcomes. So if you really think about how complicated that is, but how simple it is, and it's something we don't think about often, this is why there appear to be so many social communicative skill deficits within this spectrum disorder population. Socialization in particular, I think that this is another myth that a lot of people talk about, like, oh, these kids have difficulty with socialization, therefore these kids with this diagnosis aren't social. Not true. Their motivation and reinforcement for social interactions can be different than this population, although they may be merging, which that's a whole nother video that I'll talk about in my opinion. So when we think about social interactions for these kids generally have an expected framework for what to expect and how the interaction will go down. And in my experience, it usually has to do with an activity. Right? So when we have play dates, right, these kids like to know what we're going to do. If you set an unstructured play date, so to speak, like, oh, just someone comes over, chances are the child who was diagnosed, if it's a play date with a child who is not diagnosed, the child who is diagnosed is going to suggest or want to engage in the preferred activities that they like. The other person might say, okay, for a while, and then what happens? Y'all know this. If you have kids that are over-focused, that are diagnosed with a spectrum disorder on, I don't know, Legos, and they're playing Legos for an hour, what happens after about an indefinite amount of time, right? This kid says, that's enough. Okay, I'm bored. And your child wants to keep playing. What's wrong? I don't understand why you don't want to play. So the social interaction, in my opinion, is much geared toward activity and high preference. That's what makes the quality of the social interaction for this person who is diagnosed under the spectrum umbrella. Now, let's back up to development, right? If these kids are, say, I don't know, 6, say there's a 6-year-old who's diagnosed, a 6-year-old who is not diagnosed in this interaction. The 6-year-old who is not diagnosed is probably engaging in this activity through the lens of everything that child has learned incidentally. So this kid is probably looking at your child's, or whoever, right? Social cues. They're looking at their nonverbal cues. They're looking at their eye contact. They're looking at their social responsiveness. They're looking at, when I ask a question, when I comment, is this person going to comment back? And oftentimes the expectation that comes as a result of learning incidentally from this type of brain, and when you pair it with a child who has not naturally developed learning incidentally, there can be some confusion and some social distancing, right? So we see this as parents or guardians, and we think, oh, this isn't going well, and we start to feel bad. The quality of the interaction for this person might have been okay with the hour of Legos. The quality of interaction for your child might have been wonderful. So when we look at socialization and rules for these kids who are diagnosed with spectrum disorders, there's a certain rule, explanation, expectation that will happen in a social interaction. And usually it's much less driven toward emotional feeling about the other child. It's more about the feeling of engaging in something that's comfortable for me. And then if the child participates, then I feel good, if that makes sense. It's a different lens than this whole socially interaction, reciprocity type of thing that those of us under this umbrella expect and experience from a social interaction. So I'll talk more about that in another video. If you have questions or specific questions that I can answer as a result of this video, that would be really helpful, because socialization can go so many directions for these kids. But again, my message and what I want you to know is quality of social interactions might be really different, hence emotional responses that come up as a result of these interactions, whether they're positive, feeling like they're having enough quality interaction, or they have feelings of isolation and loneliness. And that usually is based on activity versus just how this person spoke to me, if that makes sense. Okay, talk more about this.